Ready now. Good to see everyone this morning. Glad that you could be here. A couple of little announcements I need to make. I generally don't make announcements before sermons, not my thing, but a couple little things. One is if you received a text message from the church that says if you want to be part of that group, you need to type in start in order to receive text messages that tell us what's going on. The SK Notify thing, which we've changed. If you want to get those messages and you did not receive a text, it means we don't have your phone number in the system. So you need to let one of us know, either me or Susie, so we can enter you in, and then you'll get a text that will say press start. You got to type in start and hit it, and it will let you start receiving text messages. The other thing is, some of y'all do online giving, and that's kind of been down by switching, but that is back up. So if you do online giving and you want to get back into that, to participate in that instead of writing a check, if you go to the church website, I'm sure Susie will put a link in the bulletin, but that'll probably be the next bulletin. Is it in this bulletin that's out? Be the next bulletin. But you can go to the church webpage, Henrietta CSC webpage, and go to the online giving link and tap that, and it will set you up to do online giving. So if you were in that and you want to get back in that, that's what you need to do. If you have any questions about that, let me know. Whoever left the encouraging note on my keyboard, thank you for that. I've learned something in life, in my life, and that's that you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. You really don't. We get kind of set in our life, set in our days, and days kind of go on. And I always kind of compare life to like a plateau, We go along on a plateau until something happens. Then we either fall off of it or maybe it goes up. I don't know, but things change in life. But the truth is that the older I get, the more I've had to deal with things, especially in the last couple of years, that I never really thought about dealing with, never really expected I would have to deal with. And yet those things have become a reality in my life, and I'm sure for most of us here, they'll become a reality in your life. But God prepares us for these things through our life. Often we talk about Daniel and the lion's den, and we know that story, and we hear that story in Vacation Bible School and other things, and we understand kind of that situation, but sometimes we don't understand maybe or think about that God prepared him for that lion's den, didn't he? It wasn't something that happened right off in Daniel's life. It was something that God prepared him for. And with things that happen in our life, God prepares us to deal with things that are coming through our faith, through our relationship with him, and through those things that happen. And so you and I sometimes, we kind of got to look at how that happens. And I think as I was thinking this week and dealing with some things with my mother, and dealing with some of that this week, she texted me at one point where she was actually texting me rational stuff, and she said that she had just finished the book of Daniel, which I thought that was kind of interesting to do that in the hospital, and probably not the best thing. I've got to get rid of this jacket. Probably not the best thing maybe to read her condition, but she said she had finished the book of Daniel. And it got me kind of thinking about the book of Daniel, and there's a lot of stuff with that book that's quite interesting. And a lot of it has to do with prophecy and other things that go on, but that's really not the point of this lesson. The point of this lesson is that Daniel was a unique individual in Scripture. For one thing, we don't often think that when Daniel was carried off by the Babylonians, and Israel was carried off, and they brought these young people with him, we don't often understand that when Daniel came to be in that nation, came to the point that we begin to hear the story of Daniel in Daniel chapter 1, where Daniel's with his other three Jews who will become known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he's with them, and he's telling the king that they need to eat the right food and eat clean food. But we don't often think about at that point in time, most scholars think that Daniel was probably only 13 or 14 years old when he started this. He was young. He was a young person, and yet he was already standing up for God. He was already saying, we got to eat this food. We got to be clean. We got to kind of keep our ancestry and the ways of our fathers. And so we often don't think about him being that young, but he was. And we talk about his relationship with God starting at such a young age. And of course, he'd been brought up in Judaism and knew God as the God of the Jews and the God of the Hebrews. But yet, even as a young man, he stood up and stood and stood up for God and stood up for things in his life that mattered. And you begin to see God working in him, even at a young age. But you know, another thing we don't often think about is that Daniel probably had a big social status. Most scholars think he was maybe of the lineage of Zedekiah, which was a priest. He was of the tribe of Judah. He was of the kingly tribe. You know, when the Babylonians went in and took over Israel, took over Jerusalem, they only took the people they wanted. They took the rich, they took the knowledgeable, they took the people who thought would make their kingdom better. And all the people who they thought wouldn't make their kingdom better, they left them in Jerusalem, in Judah. They called them the Anawim, the ones left behind. They left them there. So they took all the best, the brightest, those of royal lineage. They took all them back to Babylon to make them Babylonians. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to assimilate them into their culture. And they wanted to improve their kingdom with the knowledge of the kingdoms that they were conquering. That's how the Babylonians worked. And so this young Daniel is not only a young man, but he's a man of social status. He's a man that had royalty, maybe even kingly blood in Judah. He was a man who was taking out of that situation. So, you know, he wasn't somebody that came from poverty or came from a poor state. He was a boy who came from a status and came from wealth and came from all that. And that, you would think, would make it even harder for Daniel. When he was carried off by the Babylonians, it would make it harder for him to adjust to that and to say, well, now look at me. Now I'm a captive. Now I've been carried off. You know, God's deserted me. Why did God do that? But yet we don't see those traits in Daniel. And even though he had that social status in Jerusalem, it appears that he was able to overcome that, his circumstance. It was a tragic thing what happened to him. You know, often we look at the world, we look at the people around him, and we look at situations, and we kind of judge, maybe we excuse people based on that sometimes, don't we? Well, they had a rough life. They had a really bad upbringing. They come out of a really bad situation. Have you ever used those terms when we talk about somebody? And we kind of excuse sometimes their behavior, don't we? We say, well, he's kind of that way, but you know, he really had a bad childhood. He had an abusive father, a bad mother. He didn't have parents. You know, he was in a really poverty situation, or she was. We kind of use that as an excuse sometimes for behavior. And yet, you know, Daniel was a person who had been carried off from his homeland violently. And he was a person that probably saw a lot of his household, a lot of his relatives have been killed, I'm sure, by the Babylonians. He was a person who came out of a siege city that had been under siege in Jerusalem. If you don't know that story, when the Babylonians sieged Jerusalem, that siege went on about 14 months. They starved him to death. They literally were selling the dung of birds to eat. They were eating each other's children. It was unbelievable. It was tragic. It was beyond description. They starved him to death. So when Daniel came out of that, he came out of a really bad place. He was a really young man. He was a man that at some point in his life, probably that he could remember, had some social status and some social standing. We don't really think about Daniel that way, do we? But the truth is that God had something bigger for Daniel. And this was just the beginning of Daniel's walk, the beginning of what he was. But in order for us to walk with God, in order for us to grow, we have to build our faith, don't we? We have to build faith. And I don't think maybe we see that in anything more than Daniel. You know, the very first thing Daniel did is he had these 3 young men with him. And they, I guess, must have been really outstanding young men, because the Babylonians had put them aside into a special program and said, we want to make you Babylonians. We want you to be in the kingdom and be in the court of the king. We want to teach you everything about the Chaldeans, as the Bible says. And we want to feed you the food of the Chaldeans. And we want to bring you up in that culture. We're going to change your names, right? We're going to change your names. So we're going to change the name of Daniel to Belshazzar, right? We're going to change the other 3 guys' names to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We get Babylonian names. We're going to feed you Babylonian food. We're going to dress you in Babylonian clothes. We want you to be Babylonians. And so that's what they did. But Daniel was the one who stood up, and he said, we don't want to eat your food. your food's not clean. Your food's not something that we would eat, and we don't want to eat your food. We want to eat our own food. We want to eat the food that we were. We don't want to drink the drink that you have. And they said, well, you got to do that because that's who you need to be. That's who you're going to be. And Daniel says, no, we don't want to. And the guy said, well, I'm going to get in big trouble. If you eat this food, you want to eat these vegetables, which we know now that's probably a good thing, right? But they didn't think that was a good thing. And he said, if you eat these vegetables and everything and you get looking bad, he says, they're going to come down on me. And so Daniel made him a deal. He says, listen, if you'll give us the food I want, let us drink the drink and give us this stuff, and if we look good, then we can eat that. And so after 10 days, they come back, and they look better than the other guys. And so Daniel, he already saw God working here. He already started to build on his faith. He didn't want to defile himself with the king's food. He didn't want to defile himself with the king's drink. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to hold on to his heritage, hold on to who he was, hold on to his God. That was important to him. It was important to Daniel from a young age that he do that he holds on to his God. You know, I remember as a young person, 12 or 13, maybe 11 years old, I remember the first real conversation I had with God. You know, I mean, I prayed a lot, right? I mean, Mom made me say that terrible prayer that we teach our kids to pray that we should never pray about, now I lay me down to sleep. Right, pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, why on earth do we make kids pray that? I do not know, right? I pray my Lord my soul to take. Looking back, I'm like, that's terrible. You know, I mean, it's awful to say that, right? I mean, if I die before I wake up, that's surprising I ever slept as a child, you know? But you know, I remember the first time I really had a conversation with God. I mean, I remember like it was yesterday. First time I really, really had a conversation with God. I remember that. I was in the back of a Ford Pinto, laying in the back of it. I was on the way between Catholic church and the Baptist church because that was my childhood, Mass, went to Mass. And I remember the first real conversation I had with God. And I remember what the conversation was. I remember like it was yesterday. And I said, God, I don't know what's right. I don't know which is true. I don't know if this is true. I don't know if this is true. I know these are really different. And I just don't see how both of these can be right. And I remember praying that. I remember asking God that when I was like 11, still in Colorado. So it's like I was 11 years old. And I remember that just like it was yesterday. I remember that. And I think when you do that as a child, as a young person, it's easy to pray. It's easy to maybe say your prayers. But, you know, there's a time when you really have a conversation with God, something that matters. And I'll get back to that story. And so he wanted to, Daniel was that man, right? He wanted to keep his God, keep his faith, keep what he had, hold on to something. Wouldn't you want to do that if you was Daniel? And you was 13 or 14 years old, and you'd come from starvation, you'd come from a royal family, and you'd been taken to a foreign land and taken away from your parents and your family and put with these other kids in this whatever it was. Wouldn't you want to hold on to something that was yours? I would. And the only thing Daniel had to hold on to was God. Because everything else in Daniel's life had been taken away from him. And so Daniel held on to God. And Daniel made this decision and made this come up. And it was amazing. Because God started to introduce himself to them. You know, I don't know at 12 or 13 or 14 years old, you know, Daniel had this faith and had this God, but I don't know that he really understood it. Because I think at 11 or 12 years old, even when I had that conversation with God, I still don't think I really understood God. I know I didn't. I know I didn't really understand. I really understand what God wanted or what God could do in my life. I really didn't understand those things. And Daniel didn't either. But over time, Daniel began to introduce himself to God, and God introduced himself to them. You know, God is a two-way street. It's not just about me knowing God. It's about God knowing me. And sometimes we forget that. And when God blessed Daniel and what he did, and God answered Daniel's prayer, and God began to bless Daniel with their health and their vigor and their appearance, and then God began to give them knowledge, and God began to impart on them intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood dreams and visions. And God began to introduce himself to Daniel. This is who I am. And because of that, Daniel began to have a relationship with God, because that's what we have to have, you see. We have to have a relationship with God. It can't just be in passing. It can't just be this on the surface thing. If you're really a Christian, you got to have a relationship with God. And in order to do that, you have to understand God, and God understands you. That's what relationship is all about, and that's what began to happen in the life of Daniel. And it wasn't long before there was an impossible situation. You know, the next thing we really know about Daniel is Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, doesn't he? And he brings in all the wise people and the magicians and the sorcerers and everybody that he thinks is so smart. And he brings them all in, and he says, I've had a dream, and I want you to interpret it for me. Well, in those days, interpreting dreams, that was a really big thing. And so all his magicians and his sorcerers, they said, oh king, we want to do that. We want to interpret you. Just tell us the dream, and we'll tell you what it means. Right? We're ready to do that. We're ready to serve. Old King Nebuchadnezzar, he says, I'm going to tell you something. He says, you only got to interpret my dream. He says, you got to tell me what I dreamt. And all the sorcerers and all the magicians, they said, nobody ever asked that. Nobody's ever asked that. That's what they said. Nobody ever anywhere in any kingdom has ever asked anybody to tell them what the dream was. Right? How can we tell you what your dream means if you won't even tell us what you dreamt? And the king Nebuchadnezzar, he says, I'm telling you, boys. He says, it's more than that. He says, if you can't tell me what my dream was, he says, I'm going to have you dismembered. That's exactly what he said. I'm going to have you dismembered. I'm going to have your arms and legs pulled off. And I'm going to burn down your houses. Which is the time your arms and legs are pulled off. I don't care if you care if your house is burned down or not, but that's pretty bad, right? And so they're pretty scared. I would be scared. Would you be scared? I was scared. So they go to Daniel. And they says, Daniel, we can't do this, right? And we need help. And Daniel says, well, I can't do it either. But he says, I know somebody that can. So Daniel prays to God, and God reveals to him the dream. He says, oh, King Nebuchadnezzar, he says, you had a dream. And Daniel never takes credit for it. Daniel says, God told me what your dream. You had a dream of a great statue with a head of gold and a breast of bronze. And he says, I'm going to tell you what that means. He says, that's about 4 kingdoms. And you, O Nebuchadnezzar, in Babylon, you are the head of gold, right? But there'll be a nation after you that'll come and will take your kingdom, and that'll be the Medes and the Persians. And after that, there'll be another kingdom, the Greeks. And after that, there'll be another kingdom, the Romans. This isn't a sermon about the statue. But it's a sermon about the idea that God gave Daniel what he needed. You see how faith builds? It's when we get answers to prayers, when things happen in our lives and we see God at work in our lives. That's how faith builds. Daniel says, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever. For wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings. He establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals profound and hidden things and knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. You see, when prayers start to get answered in your life and things start to happen in your life, you begin to know God, and you begin to have faith, and you begin to take on challenges that you didn't think you could ever take on. When I made that prayer in the back of that Pinto in Colorado all those many, many years ago that I still remember to this day, I never knew or expected how God would ever answer my prayer. And yet, by some stroke of whatever you would call it, providence, I guess, we wound up in a town that I'd never heard of, in a state that I never intended to live in a school that I certainly didn't want to go to. And I met a woman who changed my life and who showed me the truth of what God was. You see, every time in my life I doubt, I think, well, maybe God doesn't really listen to me. Maybe God doesn't hear me. Maybe God doesn't really care. And every time I do that, I go back and I think, God brought me to a town I didn't know, to a state I never intended to live in, to a school that I certainly didn't want to go to, and introduced me to a woman who would change my life for him. And I think if God done that, then God knows, God cares, God hears. You see, Daniel began to trust in God because he knew that God answered, that God cared, that God knew. I have faith in God because I've seen God so many times in my life answer things that I've asked of him to help me through things that I didn't think I could get through. And that doesn't mean my life's been perfect. And those of you that know me, you know that my life is far from perfect, and that I've dealt with many things in my life, as have many of you. Many tragedies in my life, many losses in my life, many things in my life that I have to ask God why. And yet, I believe that God hears, that God knows, that God cares, because he's proven that to me in so many other ways. You see, Daniel understood that, and you and I should understand that. But Daniel, I think the interesting story in Daniel is his friends. We don't talk much about those guys. We kind of introduce them at the beginning, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel kind of goes to him on the prayer thing, says, hey guys, help me pray. We really need God to get on this or we're going to lose our arms, right? And you kind of hear it there when he goes and talks to him. But then we don't hear a lot more about it until we hear about this great statue that Nebuchadnezzar builds on the plain of Dura, right? And the great statue that Nebuchadnezzar builds, and he goes out and he says, everybody's going to fall down and worship the statue, right? All you guys are going to fall down and worship the statue. And I think it's a story that we hear, and there's a lot of things about it we like, but it's a story we don't maybe think about some of the ramifications of it. One thing is Daniel's not there. I don't know where Daniel is. I don't have a clue. But Daniel's not there. It's just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's just these three friends of Daniel's. And so the king says, when you hear all this music and everything, everybody's going to fall down and worship this image. And of course, he plays the music, and everybody falls down, but not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are standing. They're the only ones standing up, right? I mean, you show up when you do that, right? They're the only ones standing up. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, he pulls them up there, and he says, boys, I'm giving you one more chance. He says, I'm going to sound all this music, and you're going to fall down and worship this statue, or else I'm throwing you into that fire. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego maybe said one of the most profound statements in the whole Bible. It says, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. But he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." But this is the best statement. "But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." You see, Daniel wasn't alone. Daniel had at least 3 other guys who were just as faithful as Daniel. And Daniel had them to lay on and rely on, not just himself. And it teaches the importance of having people in our lives that influence us for God. The importance of putting people in our lives that are good and that are moral and that are Christian and that are godly. It gives us the idea that if we surround ourselves with godly people, we'll be godly. And if we surround ourselves with ungodly people, well, you fill in the blank. Right? The truth is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, without Daniel there, did the right thing. But can you imagine after they did that and they went to meet Daniel? Can you imagine the conversation they had? Said, "Oh, Daniel, we could feel the heat, brother. We could feel the heat. But we stood for what was right." And don't you know, Daniel hugged her necks and says, "I'm so proud of you guys, right? I'm so proud of you for doing what you did." And don't you know they were better with each other because of what they did? Because when we stand together and we encourage one another and we walk with one another and we get through things with one another, then we come out stronger on the other side. And Daniel knew that, and we should know that. You know, the truth is that Daniel, he saw God's plan so many times. It's not just a dream, but you know, there's another story in the book of Daniel about King Nebuchadnezzar where he thought he was the greatest, right? And he had this other dream about this tree that was there, and the tree got cut down. There was a band of iron placed around it. And so he called Daniel, because obviously Daniel's a dream guy, right? So he calls Daniel up. He says, "Daniel, get over here. I got a dream. You just tell me what it means." So Daniel comes up. He says, "So king, what it means?" He says, "You're a great king, and you got a great kingdom, and everything's wonderful." But he says, "The truth is that unless you acknowledge that God's God and you don't think that it's all you," he said, "God's going to take it away from you for a while, and you're going to eat grass like the cattle, and your fingernails are going to grow, and your hair is going to grow. But guess what?" He says, "Eventually, you're going to come to know that God's God, and God's going to give it all back to you." And so sure enough, old King Nebuchadnezzar gets up one morning, gets out on the balcony of his palace, looks out, he goes, "I'm a great king. Look at this great kingdom that I've built. I am just marvelous." And God made him lose his mind. So he went out in the field and he ate grass like a cow. And he slept out in the field and he ate grass. Can you imagine that? I don't know. I've never ate grass, but it sounds pretty bad. And he ate grass and his fingernails grew out and his hair grew out and he became this wild man of the field. But then one day he wakes up and he goes, "God, I know you're God. I know you're supreme, and I know that it's you and not me." And God gave him back his kingdom. He says, "At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me, and glory of my kingdom. My counselors and nobles began seeking me out, so I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true, and his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride." You know, all this brings us up to a lion's den, doesn't it? It wasn't Nebuchadnezzar, because what happened was the image of the statue came true, and the Medes and Persians came in, and they took over that. And the Medes and Persians were so strong that when they came into the Babylonian kingdom, the Babylonians just opened the gates and let them come in. So nothing got destroyed, nobody died. But he comes in, the king comes in, Darius. Darius comes in, and Darius knows the worth of Daniel. Daniel's a mighty man by this time, mighty in works and deeds. People are probably talking about Daniel. And everybody's jealous of Daniel, and everybody wants Daniel dead. The others do. And they say, "Well, we'll never catch him in something wrong because Daniel's too good a guy. Never going to catch him doing anything wrong. The only way we can trap Daniel is by trapping him in his faith, because that's the only thing that we can do. Because Daniel's good. You're never going to get rid of Daniel." And so they come up with this plan, right? And they said, "This is what we're going to do. When Daniel prays, we're going to put a thing that nobody can pray to other God, and when Daniel prays, we're going to convict him in this. We're going to throw him in the lion's den. The king's going to sign it with a signet ring, so he can't take it back," because the king loved Daniel, right? Going to have him sign it with a signet ring, so he can't take it back, and he's got to throw Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel's going to be destroyed. We're going to get rid of that Daniel so that we can be great, because we're never going to be great as long as Daniel's here, because Daniel's greater, right? And in life, isn't that how we think, right? Sometimes the best way to the top is to eliminate the people that are ahead of us. I mean, that's not a good thought, but that's kind of the world, right? And so they thought, we'll just get rid of Daniel, then we'll be great. So we get thrown in there. But I hope you see this morning that by the time Daniel got to the lion's den, he was ready, right? He had saw God at work. He'd saw God in action. He saw God's plan executed. He'd come to know God. God had come to know him. By the time the lion's den came up, Daniel was ready. And when Daniel knew the king's decree and knew that he'd be thrown in the lion's den, he didn't hesitate. He went up there like he'd always did, and he threw up his windows, and he prayed, faced Jerusalem, and he prayed to God. And they took him before the king and said, we're going to throw you in the lion's den because look at what you've done. You've disobeyed the king's decree. To the lion's den with you, O Daniel. And don't you think Daniel was just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? He says, my God's able to deliver me, but even if he's not, I'll go to the lion's den. He was ready. And I think that's life for a Christian. I think we go through a whole lot of things in our life when we're young, and hopefully we have a relationship with God, and we work that up and we build that up. So that when things really happen, bad things really happen, because if you're young in here, just ask an older person. Bad things are going to happen. Fact of life. Eventually you're going to lose your parents, if you have them now. One day you'll bury them. Am I right? One day you're going to bury a lot of people you love. You are. You're going to see people suffer in your life. It's going to happen. But if you've been a Christian your entire life, you're ready for the lion's den. You're ready to face whatever that is that's going to happen, because you know that God's going to give you what you want. And even if he doesn't, you know he's still God. You got to be ready for the lion den. And Daniel was. And God spared him, didn't he? And the Bible says that God not only spared Daniel, but when all those people who wrongly convicted him were thrown into that den with their families, if you read the text, it says that the lions devoured them before they ever hit the ground. But they never touched Daniel. And the king says, I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is a living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. You know, I'll share with you something this morning. The God of Daniel is the God of Rex. You believe me? The God of Daniel is the God of you. The God who spared Daniel from the lions is the God who will spare you, the God who will keep you, the God who will guard you, the God who will see you through the lion's dens in your life. We serve the same God. He's the I am. He lives. And if he cared about him, he cares about me, and he cares about you. So I don't know tomorrow. I don't. And I don't know the next day or the next year. Only God knows. And I don't know if it'll be good. I don't know if it'll be bad. But I know that whatever it is, I'm going to serve my God. Because in the end, he's the only hope I have in this life and the next. Are you ready for the lion's den? It's coming. Are you ready? If we can help you in any way this morning, won't you let it be known while we stand and sing?